You keep your pebble off.
More comedy on BBC1 after the news with Harry Enfield.
Wednesday night on BBC1 and at 7.
They were rocking and rolling, ducking and diving in 1959.
At 7:30 in a special Tomorrow's World, a sneak preview of a gem fit for a king. Then at 8 o'clock...
If only you were rich.
The first midweek draw in the National Lottery Live. Carol Smiley presents a special half-hour programme with a guaranteed jackpot of £10 million. And at 8:30...
I might have a little surprise for you tonight.
Some famous fans present their favourite moments in a Dad's Army selection box.
He's doomed! Doomed!
Wednesday night on BBC1.
The clock is ticking for Ali McCoist.
Which striker scored goals in 2 English FA Cup finals during the 90s, but with different clubs?
Oh, come on, what are you looking at? My boy goes to school in 2 years.
A question of sport. Answers in by Friday, 8:30.
And don't forget to turn your TV sets off.
Garden Water features with Jeff Hamilton on BBC 2 now, and then a little dry-mouthed explorer Benedict Allen encounters Big Game at 9:30. On BBC 1, the 9 o'clock news with Peter Sissons.
At least 70 Israeli soldiers have died in the worst military accident in Israel's history. 2 troop-carrying helicopters exploded after a collision, spreading blazing wreckage over a settlement in northern Israel. Myra Hindley's lawyers prepare to challenge the Home Office decision that she can never be released. And John Major goes to Brussels to condemn the social chapter as the Trojan horse that could take us back to the 70s. Good evening. 2 Israeli military helicopters packed with troops and ammunition collided and crashed tonight in northern Israel. There was a huge explosion and blazing wreckage came down on a communal settlement. A military commander at the scene said at least 70 soldiers and crewmen had been killed. The previous highest in a military accident in Israel was 54. The helicopters, which were heading for southern Lebanon, came down in bad weather just east of Kiryat Shimona in eastern Galilee. From Israel, Jeremy Bowen has just sent this report.
There were more explosions after the first impact. It's thought they were caused by ammunition that the helicopters had been carrying for the mission in Lebanon. The helicopters were heading north in stormy weather when they collided. The men on board the 2 aircraft were members of an elite combat unit, taking their turn to patrol the strip of South Lebanon that Israel has occupied since the late 70s. Rescuers were on the scene minutes after the helicopters came down. There was very little they could do. The aircraft crashed onto a farming village in an area of Israel known as the Galilee Panhandle, close to the border with Lebanon. Witnesses told Israeli television that one of the helicopters blew up in midair after the collision. Wreckage landed on a cemetery. The other helicopter crashed while the pilot appeared to be struggling to make an emergency landing. Sections of his helicopter smashed into farm buildings. Reports in Israel said the helicopters would most likely have cut their lights since they were on an operational mission. A government statement described the crash as an unimaginably heavy tragedy. The hearts of the nation, it said, were with the victims. The whole country, the statement went on, weeps over the loss of these young fighters. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Jerusalem.
And we'll bring you up to date on that as we get more details. Here, the Home Secretary has confirmed that Myra Hindley, the murderess with the deaths of at least 5 children on her conscience, will never be released from jail. The official statement opens the way for her lawyers to challenge the legality of the sentence, which they're now expected to do after describing it as both unlawful and inhumane and as a response to political pressure. Relatives of her victims said they were delighted and that the decision was totally right.
In H-Wing at Durham Jail, Myra Hindley was said to be unsurprised by the Home Secretary's decision. She's now expected to challenge it in the courts. Hindley is 54. She was sentenced to life in 1966 with her lover Ian Brady for the murders of 3 children. She later confessed to killing 2 others. Today, unusually, the government was prepared to discuss the case.
Myra Hindley will serve her whole life in prison. We believe that is justified by the crime, which included premeditation. It was multiple murders. Children were involved. All the circumstances of the crime, we believe, point to the rightness of a whole life terror.
The murders on Saddleworth Moor have lost none of their horror down the years. The jury at the trial of Hindley and Brady heard tape recordings of the tortured victims. It was, say many, a uniquely wicked crime which cannot be punished too harshly. A former judge feels so strongly that he wrote to a national newspaper supporting the Home Secretary.
I've had a telephone call from a policewoman who was on the case, thanking me for writing the letter, saying that she heard the tapes of the children. And it absolutely broke her heart, and she's never completely got over it.
Michael Howard's ruling that in Hindley's case life should mean life follows earlier decisions about her imprisonment. A decade ago, Mr. Howard's government agreed that she could be considered for release after 30 years. Now, campaigners accuse the Home Secretary of singling out one prisoner for exceptional treatment.
Everybody knows in the system she's not dangerous. So why are we keeping her in prison? It can only be for revenge. I don't believe the British people are about revenge.
Myra Hindley is now expected to seek a judicial review of the Home Secretary's decision. Her lawyers will argue that it's unlawful and inhumane. She's not the only prisoner to be given no hope of release, but the first to take her grievance to court. John Silverman, BBC News.
The Prime Minister has said that head teachers could face a compulsory test of their competence following a damning report from England's Chief Inspector of Schools. In his annual report, Chris Woodhead criticised 3,000 head teachers for providing weak leadership. But as our education correspondent Mike Baker reports, the standard of actual teaching in most schools is improving.
Tonight, the Chief Schools Inspector was in the Lion's Den, confronting an audience of teachers who feel he's been attacking them unfairly.
One key to raising standards is partnership, and it grates a bit to hear Chris Woodhead lecture us on that.
Mr. Woodhead says his target isn't teachers, but rather the outdated progressive orthodoxies of the 70s, which he believes have damaged education. He insists his report includes some good news, specifically an overall improvement in teaching quality.
The culture is changing. It's slow, it's hard, it's painful, but my visits to schools, my reading of the inspection reports, my attendance at conferences leads me to believe that more teachers are now standing back, thinking about things in a rigorous way, and as a result, standards of pupil achievement are increasing.
On the negative side, Mr. Woodhead says too many teachers aren't able or confident enough to teach computing. He accuses 1 in 7 primary head teachers and 1/10 of secondary heads of poor management and leadership. And he says around 13,000 teachers, that's 3.5%, are incompetent, although that's less than last year.
The critical issue is what can you do about those teachers and how can they be helped? You cannot help teachers by threatening them. You can help them by supporting them, and I wish you would emphasise that.
Graham Went was an experienced primary head teacher until his school failed its Ofsted inspection. His own management was criticised. He's now left the school and is unemployed.
The issue for me is the narrow terms of the inspection process. It wasn't able to take into account adequately the number of languages that we had in the school, for example. But the whole notion that public humiliation, which is what special measures amounts to, is a firm basis on which to take a school forward is beyond credibility.
Head teachers aren't currently required to have a specific qualification, although Labour has proposed one. This afternoon, the Prime Minister said he didn't rule out making the government's proposed voluntary qualification compulsory too. There's good and bad news in this report. According to the Chief Inspector, there has been an overall improvement in the quality of teaching. But there's still a small but significant number of incompetent teachers who are having a major impact on standards. Mike Baker, BBC News at the Schools Inspectorate.
Two authoritarian governments in Eastern Europe gave way tonight to the democratic movements they've been trying to hold at bay. After months of street protests, Serbia agreed to recognise the opposition's victory in November's elections. And just across the border in Bulgaria, street protests won the concession of an early general election. We have a report from both countries. David Loyne reports from the Bulgarian capital, Sofia, on the Democrats' victory there. But first, Ola Gerin reports from the Serbian capital, Belgrade, where President Milosevic has finally given in to street protest and international pressure and recognised the recent election results.
Day 78 of the pro-democracy rallies. Today, opposition leaders came before the crowd with word of what could be a major victory. President Milosevic was telling Parliament to accept the disputed results of November's local elections. The official announcement of the president's move came on state television. Still, the opposition response was guarded.
I would like to see decision of the full restating of election results for November 17, and after that I will be ready to comment that.
Tonight, Yugoslav Federal President Zoran Lilic said the Serbian leader's move meant the election victories would be reinstated. The protesters had won. But after so many twists and turns in this dispute, many on the streets were not prepared to believe it.
Milosevic is just trying to buy some more time for himself because he's thinking, because he's very weak now.
Even if the election victories are reinstated, that may not mean the end of the protests. The opposition has other demands, including press freedom and punishment for those involved in Sunday night's violent crackdown. The opposition say they'll keep protesting, so no one here expects this to mean the end of the riot police. But tonight the streets were being cleared for now. If this isn't the end, it looks like the beginning of the end. Orla Gerin, BBC News, Belgrade.
Protesters in Bulgaria learnt from Serbia that constant peaceful demonstrations can work. A month after the protests began, they chant the name of President Petar Stoyanov, who succeeded in persuading the former Communist Party, re-elected just 3 years ago, to step aside for new elections. The crowd, after demonstrating night after night in freezing temperatures, celebrate their victory. The president said he'd averted a civil war. Before the decision, the mood on the streets was becoming uglier. Once workers joined the protesters a week ago in forcing a general strike, Bulgaria became ungovernable. Hyperinflation means prices change every hour. Non-communist parties now have another chance to win an election.
We believe very deeply that it's going to happen a miracle, and it happened in Bulgaria. And the socialists give up, and we hope that this is a new page for the Bulgarian history.
The victory of these people completes unfinished business left over from the collapse of the communist regime in 1989. Maybe this time Bulgaria will have a chance to rejoin Europe. It's the last act of the Velvet Revolution. David Loyne, BBC News, Sofia.
The Prime Minister has told Britain's European partners that he will never compromise on the social chapter. In a blunt speech in Brussels, he said the legislation would lead Britain back to the industrial strife that brought us to our knees in the 70s. The social chapter doesn't cover the 48-hour week or the minimum wage, but it does give workers a legal right to 3 months paternity leave, works councils in large companies, and equal rights for part-timers. But as our political editor Robin Oakley reports, Mr Major's speech is aimed as much at voters here as his audience in Brussels.
Mr Major arrived in Brussels to spell out an uncompromising message. Europe isn't working. Blaming European leaders for the 18 million on the dole across the European Union, he insisted they should all switch direction from the European social model to the British enterprise economy. The recipe for more jobs, he said, was curbing taxes and state spending, taming unions and scrapping laws which throttled business. Europe, by contrast, was over-regulating.
Now, it may sound responsible and caring, but I believe the European social model is, in fact, fundamentally flawed. It deprives today's companies of the chance to compete and drives away tomorrow's investment and new jobs. Over-regulation does not work, and as a result, nor do millions of Europeans.
His chief target was the social chapter, the Maastricht Treaty provision for lawmaking on workers' conditions, from which he secured an opt-out. He would never sign it.
Because one signature on the social chapter would mean 500,000 British signatures on the dole, and that is not a deal I am prepared to contemplate. All Britain would gain from the social chapter is a less competitive economy and more unemployment. First stop, social chapter, next stop, social security.
Though he argues there's worse to come, the only social chapter legislation so far has been on works councils and parental leave, and European leaders have dismissed Mr Major's arguments as tired, old and misleading. Opposition parties at home accused him of playing politics to cover up Tory divisions.
I have challenged John Major today to explain where he gets his figure of 500,000 lost jobs from. There is no study, no source that comes remotely near giving any evidence for such a claim, and John Major knows it. This is a figure plucked out of thin air.
If the Prime Minister spent a little bit more time leading his party and sorting out the divisions, Britain's standing abroad, our influence in Europe, and ultimately our jobs and our prosperity would be much greater than this kind of pointless scaremongering.
Mr Major's do-it-like-me demands will have ruffled European feathers. But with Labour pledged to sign up rapidly to the social chapter, his real target was a domestic one. Out of step with the continent and glorying in it, Mr Major's talking up Europe as an election issue and adopting an increasingly Euro-combative tone. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Brussels.
4 people have been injured, one of them seriously, in a train crash in southeast London. A freight train came off the rails near Bexley Station and crashed into workshops under the railway arches. At first it was thought 20 people were trapped, but later they were all accounted for. The government has suffered 2 defeats in the House of Lords over its plans to clamp down on handguns. Peers first voted to allow .22 pistols to be kept at home if the working parts were kept separately. Later, peers voted in favour of compensation for gun dealers and makers. Health officials have admitted they should have acted more quickly over the meningitis outbreak that killed 2 students in Cardiff last November. Bro Taff Health Authority said a case 4 weeks earlier should have been treated as a warning of the outbreak. The government has unveiled ambitious plans to try to coordinate health and social service care for the mentally ill. Campaigners say it's an attempt finally to sort out the problems of care in the community following the closure of most large mental institutions over the last 20 years. The number of NHS psychiatric beds in England has fallen from nearly 150,000 in 1955 to less than half that by the mid-1980s. Another third of those beds have gone in the last decade, despite growing concern that care in the community was failing public and patients alike. Our social affairs editor Neil Dickson reports.
Life will never be the same for Madeleine Rollison. 3 years ago, her son Danny started to show signs of paranoia. He was 16.
He was the most honest person I ever knew, and in a lot of ways naive. He trusted people too much.
Eventually, he became too disturbed to live at home. After trying to commit suicide, he was discharged from hospital without support into bed and breakfast accommodation.
He thought he'd caused a war. He thought that people were out to kill him, that people were out to kill us, his family, and that the only way to resolve this situation was to kill himself.
In October last year, back in hospital, Danny hanged himself. An independent inquiry concluded more could have been done to prevent his death. Today, the Health Secretary admitted there had been too many failures. His Green Paper includes the option of a new mental health authority in each area.
It reflects the recommendations of many of the reports into mental health failings and further demonstrates the government's commitment to improve the delivery of mental health care.
Care in the community was born in the 60s, a reaction to the squalor of the old asylums. But shutting the hospitals was one thing, keeping patients stable in the community was quite another. The professionals overestimated what new treatments could do, the politicians underestimated the cost. By the 90s, as the big asylums closed for the last time, the policy seemed to be failing. Ministers produced one new initiative after another to no avail. For some campaigners, what was needed was the structural reform proposed today.
We have seen over the past 20 years patients or sufferers being tossed between the health services and the social services. We have seen nobody being accountable for when the tragedies happen. And what we feel should be done about is a single body should be accountable for every mentally ill person in their area.
But the existing authorities want more resources, not more reform. They point to success stories like Venetia Gibbs. After a nervous breakdown, she didn't speak for 8 months.
Can I have a sausage roll, please?
Now, with community care from a number of agencies, she is managing on her own. A new structure for the mental health services may well help with coordination. What it won't do is relieve the enormous pressures on the current system. Ministers accept the need for a comprehensive range of services. And only once that's in place will community care become an unqualified success. Neil Dickson, BBC News, at the Department of Health.
Car makers have reacted angrily to the results of a new series of crash tests which were designed to help car buyers choose the safest cars. Testers crashed 7 popular models in the Super Mini class, but did so at higher speeds than previously used. The Rover 100, based on the old Metro, came out worst.
1/3 of all new cars sold are classed as Super Minis, and the Transport Department arranged independent tests of 7 of the most popular models to see what happened in a typical crash. Organised in conjunction with European road safety experts, the tests exceeded the EU regulations coming into force next year. The cars were crashed at 64 kilometres an hour, or 40 mph, similar to tests in the United States and Australia. In the test, none of the cars was awarded the maximum 4 stars, but the Ford Fiesta and Volkswagen Polo did get 3. The Fiat Punto, Nissan Micra, Renault Clio and Vauxhall Corsa got 2 stars. The last of the 7, the Rover 100, formerly the Metro, scored just 1 star. The reason? Watch the Fiesta test. Although there's considerable distortion, the passenger compartment remains stable, with only slight door buckling, and driver protection is good. By contrast, the Rover 100 suffers excessive deformation of the passenger compartment and the door splits. But the worst fault was the airbag's failure to protect the driver. The dummy's head hits the windscreen pillar. Car makers say the tests were both unfair and misleading.
The tests are worrying to us because they, in part, cover testing requirements in excess of anything that we have to design to, both now and in the future. And therefore, the results will give a gross distortion on the standards of the Super Mini type cars that we have to reach.
But the engineers who devised the tests rejected that claim.
The most important thing is, are the tests here appropriate to accident?